Welcome back to the Bible in Context, where context is king and the original author's intent drives our interpretation. And this time we have a repeat guest with us. We have Aaron Sherwood. We had him on previously to talk about his work in Romans and the Old Testament in Romans and Paul's argument in Romans. So this time he's going to be telling us about Galatians. Aaron emailed me a few months ago now and said that he had been compiling some notes on Galatians and also putting together his own translation, and somehow has accidentally written a book on Galatians. However, one accidentally writes a book, but I've read through it. It's great. And so he has a lot of insights from his translation, from his work in Galatians to bring to just those who would want to understand that book. And so we want to have him on again and talk about the book of Galatians. So, hey, Aaron, glad to have you back.
Thank you very much. I was looking forward to this, and I'm excited to do this again with you guys.
Awesome. Well, tell us a little bit, first of all, for those who may not know you or haven't been through the Romans content yet, tell us just a little bit about yourself, and then tell us how you got into this whole side project with Galatians.
Well, I have a background as a Bible scholar. I did a few years of teaching in different seminaries and colleges. My newest gig is I'm teaching at high school level because getting college gigs is kind of tough these days. But I've written some things here and there, and I kind of am a broad-ranging Bible theology interest expert, and I suppose I specialize in Paul, but that doesn't keep me out of other parts of the Bible. And then for this Galatians thing, well, the document that you've got, Caleb, I explain in there that I've always thought Galatians was really hard to understand. I don't know if it's everybody else or if it's just me, but I always find it a very difficult letter to kind of pull apart and piece together again. And so the story was just, I was driving around in my car listening to some old lectures from one of my professors, Gordon Fee, and little footnote here, everything we're going to talk about today, I think, really overlaps with Gordon's commentary from 2006 or 2009. So I'm not sure if I'm adding anything that he's already said. So if people are interested in stuff we're talking about, that's the book to go pick up first. So as I said, I was just driving around, picking up groceries, picking up kids, listening to some old lectures, and Gordon said a few things that got my mind jogging. Things I already knew about Galatians, and I'll run through those in a minute, but I had never put them together, as okay. This plus this plus this equals Galatians. And I did for the first time, like something clicked, and I went home and I said, wait a minute. And I've had to translate Galatians at different times for writing stuff, for teaching classes, and I sat down and I just started writing it, translating it again.
It is funny, though, that you mentioned that the book is kind of one of the more difficult New Testament letters, because I kind of thought that as well coming into it. And that's actually back when I was still very young and learning Greek, I guess. That was one of the first books that I gravitated towards and translated Galatians. Not nearly as well as what you did in yours, but it was a fun project and really helped me. And it was encouraging because I think I kind of had that predisposition to look at the overall argument rather than just pulling out theological high points. So in that, I think this is going to be really cool for me just to see my young translation compared to this, which is along the same kind of trajectory of interpretation that I like to push for on this podcast, as in understanding the overall author's argument.
Well, the PDF, the document I sent you, is I meant to write a translation, and here and there I put an endnote. I thought, okay, just to keep myself straight, I can go visit the endnotes. And then when I was all done, it was like tens of thousands of words long. And I realized, I didn't mean to do that. I was just trying to keep my thoughts straight. Well, all right. So what I wrote. So we'll talk, I think, over today and the next few episodes, we will talk through what I was able to discover for myself, and people can decide whether or not, oh, that's a good idea or that's a bad idea. But I was able to discover stuff through this piece of writing that you've got and I've got, but your podcast audience won't have. So I'll have to describe it.
Yeah, and as we...
So that when we...
Right. And yeah, as we step through this, we're going to be looking at, again, some of the high points and explaining things that Aaron has found in the book of Galatians, things that will be helpful, and rather than just reading through his translation. So this will, in a way, kind of function like we normally do, is almost kind of an audio commentary where you'll get notes here and there on the book of Galatians, and you can follow along in your ESV or whatever you're reading.
Right. And for the purposes of explaining or defending sort of like my learning process, because I shared with you, Caleb, before we got started, I still feel like a student of Galatians. I don't have this whole thing internalized. But I did highlights and stuff for myself, and I did notes for myself. So, well, the things that I realized first that made me go back and say, wait, I want to retranslate this and kind of put paragraph breaks in different places and make sense of it for myself. I got three main ideas that I kind of rediscovered and put together at one time. The first one is, and this is where I wish I almost had a PowerPoint I could show your podcast audience, but I'll just sort of verbally tell you the story of this.
I'm sure it's going to be good to, again, get that overall understanding what Paul's argument is, because just to frame this a little bit more, I think I was telling, again, you, Aaron, before we got going here, is that a lot of times you'll read commentaries that will focus on theological high points, different systematic themes that you see running throughout the book, without spending as much time talking about Paul's overall argument to his audience in his context. A lot of good commentaries will do that, but I think, again, Aaron is put special attention on that aspect, and I think that's what's going to be helpful and possibly different for those of you reading a lot of Galatians material.
Right. So the three things I noticed, one of them picks up on what you just said about Galatians material. My instinct, and I think kind of the impulse of a lot of commentaries in Galatians material, is to kind of go the direction of, what does Paul have to say that applies to the individual piety or the ethics of individual Christians? And I think that Galatians speaks to those. All the documents in the Bible speak to those about ethics and piety,
right?
An individual Christian life. But I realized one of those three things I went, aha, was Paul is writing to a group of people.
It's not just singular yous in there. He's not just talking to one guy in Galatia.
Right. I mean, he always does that. In Thessalonians, he's writing to the Thessalonian church. But there's a special thing going on in Galatians where he's writing to the group, because as a group, they're kind of screwing up and kind of devouring each other, he says at one point, right? So he's writing to them plural you, not singular you the whole time. He's not writing about individual piety. He's writing to them about their communal ethics and the situation that created that screwed up crisis that they have with their community situation. So that's my first thing that I read. That's my first aha. I remember that. And my second aha was, usually people look at all of Pauline's letters and say he teaches for a chunk, and then he does sort of application or ethical instructions for a chunk. And you can see that in Greek, where he teaches using what's called the indicative mood. And then he switches over to what's called the imperative mood in Greek to give his instruction. And everybody assumes, well, 12 of the other 13 Pauline documents do that. Galatians must too, but actually Galatians 5 and 6 doesn't have very many imperatives. Very few. Yeah. And so I'm going to put forward the idea that maybe that isn't a ethical section following the teaching section.
So is this a more so unique letter when compared to other Pauline literature? Or does it still bear a lot of similarities with, maybe like Corinthians, where he's dealing with specific groups within the church?
Right. It's Paul through and through. It's very typical, but it's also very atypical the way you just suggested. It sort of stands out from the other dozen Pauline letters because it's doing something kind of speaking to a unique situation, and it has a unique format.
Okay, so just on a very broad level, what is the overall format that we're looking at going into this letter?
Well, we'll get there in half a second, but I'm going to say that the whole thing is one long argument. Or it depends. You might either say it's one two-piece argument, or it's two arguments that together make one big argument. But there isn't this part where he stops teaching and arguing and switches to ethics like he does in a lot of those other letters. Chapters 5 and 6 are still persuasion and argumentation, all the way through to the letter.
So then what is Paul's overall argument in this letter then?
Well, can I pause a little longer and still kind of work up the way to...
Yeah, sure.
I had a third point that was really important. So the third aha moment I had was taking the well-recognized fact that there's this discussion in Galatians between Paul, the Galatians, and some other people. They're called the agitators, usually. And so it's a three-way discussion, and that's well known. But the thing that went aha for me was, wait, they're all Christians. The agitators, the Galatians, they're already all saved. And usually when I've been taught about Galatians and when I've told other people about Galatians, the focus is Paul's idea of salvation in the gospel and the fact that you can be saved apart from the law, and it's all about salvation, salvation, salvation.
Yeah, it seems that when I've been taught about Galatians before, it's always been about you have the Christians who need to hold on to the gospel alone, and then you have these Judaizers who are definitely explicitly enemies of the gospel and in no way, shape, or form to be considered as brothers. So it's more so enemies versus family rather than maybe as you're saying, you have your church, your Christian family, and then those who are still your family in Christ, but they're just making some missteps. There's some very critical
Yeah, they're
missteps.
really critical. Who knows what the agitators called themselves? They might have called them the enlightened brethren of the Jerusalem translation of the gospel. Paul says, "Nah, they're agitators. They're agitating you guys." So,
But he does consider them
yeah,
brothers, correct?
but
Okay.
importantly, nobody's disagreeing about salvation in this letter. Paul talks about it a bit, but he doesn't talk about it because he's talking about salvation. What the disagreement is over is after you're saved, what do you do with the Christian life? If you want to look to maybe chunks of Romans or chunks of Ephesians, you can learn stuff about what Paul says about salvation. If you want to look at Galatians, what you're really looking at is after you're saved, then how do you live the Christian life? And that's where the debate is. These agitators are saying, you live the Christian life this way, and Paul comes in and says, whoa, 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 no, that destroys everything. You live the Christian life that way. So the debate isn't about salvation. The debate is about, well, that was my observation, is Paul is talking to Christians. And my conclusion is the debate isn't about salvation. The debate is about Christian life post-salvation.
Right. I think that's going to be a big turning point for a lot of people because, and I think that's what we should hit on probably quite a bit as we walk through the letter, how that plays out. Because, yeah, this typically is taken as this is Paul, like you said, describing what it means to be saved. What is salvation? What is the gospel? Not, hey, we're all brothers here, and we need to understand how we live the Christian life now that we have understood salvation.
Absolutely. So the funny little document I gave you, Caleb, you know what a Targum is?
Yeah. The Aramaic translations, we talked about this quite a bit in our canon series, at least to an extent. Obviously, the audience, you can go listen to those, but just real briefly, the Targums are Aramaic translations from anywhere from just before the time of Jesus to, I believe, up into about the 7th or 8th century. And there are a lot of times more like paraphrases, kind of like maybe the Message Bible in a way.
Sometimes.
But yeah.
So I took a page from that when I was doing this for myself. It was my own notes. I wasn't trying to create something that would be authorized. But I said, I'm going to put in my translation some extra text with gray highlights for myself so that instead of having footnotes I got to keep flipping the page to, I just had my own personal notes right there inside the text so that I could read through and try and keep it all in my head.
It's more like an amplified Bible.
Yeah. So you've talked about this before in your podcasts where the texts in the Old Testament that Jews might read might say, God says to his people, stop being naughty. And then the reader will say, God says to his people, the nation of Israel, stop being naughty. And they'll insert that. And then later on when it gets written down, they include the inserts as sort of explanatory notes, right? That's right. How the Targums come about. That's what I did for myself. So the thing I sent to you has these gray highlighted chunks. And then I have all these endnotes that adds all the length to the thing. But what I discovered was some interesting things about, when I did that for myself, I discovered some interesting things about what I think the actual structure of Galatians is. For example, about how it's argument, persuasion all the way through to the end. It never switches to an ethics section. I learned that for myself. I discovered that by doing this translation process. And so now I can kind of maybe give you a quick overview of the letter and say, ooh, this is what I think I've discovered. I'd like to share it with you, run it by everybody.
Yeah. Give us a quick overview of what is Paul's overall argument. And then again, as we go through the next several episodes, we're going to have a whole mini-series on Galatians, and we'll get to talk about how each of those separate sections contribute to the overall argument, like you're saying. So what is that overall argument Paul's driving at?
All right. Well, first of all, what it isn't, if we are right about kind of what we're noticing together right now, what it isn't is the typical thing that you see where usually a class or a book will divide it up into chapters 1 to 2 are biography, where Paul's sort of apostleship is his credibility is being defended. And then chapters 3 to 4 are argument, where again, the typical assumption is Paul's talking about salvation in the gospel and how it's law free. And salvation is the focus in those argument chapters of 3 and 4. And then chapters 5 and 6 are ethics, what you're supposed to do about grace and the gospel and stuff. And if that's not what it is, kind of what I'm discovering that it is instead, is we start off with the first 5 verses in chapter 1 is a greeting. And it's got some interesting distinctives to itself, right? Where Paul hits some points harder than others. And then normally in pretty much every other Pauline letter, you'd have a prayer and thanksgiving. You don't have that. Next in Galatians, you have a curse formula. So
Right.
Even if the Galatians hadn't ever read 1 Corinthians or Philippians, the fact that there was a curse formula would have perked up their ears because they would have said, ooh, this is not a normal letter like that we would expect in the first century. What's he doing here? And then you have, I would say, from 110 to 610 is all argument. It's either, like I said, a 2-part single argument or 2 arguments that blend together to make one big long argument. All argument, and then there's the final greeting. And do you want me now to give you a quick run through of all the argument, or do you want to do that later?
Yeah, give us give us. I know in the so in the actual document that you sent me, you actually had an overall statement in, I don't know, maybe a very short paragraph or a couple sentences. I can't remember how long it was now, but that kind of gave an overview of here's the big umbrella that Paul is operating under. So what is that big umbrella that we can drill down into the details as we go through?
Well, basically Paul is trying to tell the Galatians that they need to keep living the Christian life in continuity with the same way that they originally came to Jesus. That they came to Jesus as a gift, and the gift, that grace of being in relationship with Jesus, is the bedrock fundamental thing that is the only basis of their entire Christian life. And where Paul is arguing, because the agitators are saying, they're saying it's grace plus, in their case, it's a reintroduction of certain parts of Torah observance from pre-Jesus Judaism. And Paul is going to say, all right, my positive case is it's just the relationship with Jesus is just fundamentally founded on grace and nothing else. And in particular, these agitators claim about reintroducing Torah observance. He's going to argue why that is both completely wrong and not what Scripture itself says. Scripture's on Paul's side, and the Galatians should agree with Scripture and Paul. And the addition or the reintroduction of the agitators isn't just an innocent reintroduction, but it's actually a destructive reintroduction that completely brings down grace and completely not just undoes the Christian life, but reverses possibly the salvation that they were supposed to have before the Christian life.
So within this letter, he is trying to show that salvation is, again, by grace alone, and then also showing why these agitators are wrong to reintroduce Torah observance and why it's so destructive. So with that in mind, that's what we're going to be digging more into throughout the course of these next few episodes and drilling down on more and understanding some of the nuance in Paul's argument. So just to give the audience an idea of where else we're going and what Paul is driving at here, what are some of the practical applications, or just what did you notice that was of note as you went through this letter?
Well, there's sort of 2 layers of that. There's the first century Galatian practical application, on what Paul really wanted to be the practical application for, as you've said with the podcast, sort of mission statement with the original audience, the original author's intent. And then there's, for us, the 21st century Jesus followers who think that Galatians speaks to us. For the Galatians, the practical application was, you cannot say your relationship, your ongoing life as a Christian in Jesus rests on grace plus some aspects of Torah observance. You can't do that, because that's what the agitators are saying. They're saying, don't worry, it's just grace plus a little bit of Torah. Paul says, no, it's got to be grace exclusively and wholly. You can't do plus Torah observance because, and he'll explain in more detail, why it erodes the whole thing. For 21st century people, then you can say, I'm not necessarily, I don't think of myself as a Gentile, or I don't have to.
Yeah, I don't have people in my church trying to get me to observe Torah.
There's not a lot of Judaizers coming around trying to say we got to be observing dietary laws and Sabbath and things like that.
Right.
But the message would be you can't have grace plus anything. You can't have grace plus you're not allowed to play cards. You can't have grace plus you have to go to morning service instead of evening service. You can't have grace plus you have to be involved in the youth ministry. You can't have grace plus this particular interpretation of the doctrine of baptism. There are good and bad doctrines of baptism, but that's theology. That's spiritual formation. That's not the basis of your relationship with God and Jesus. Your relationship with God and Jesus is grace only, not grace plus. It's not conditioned on having the plus something else. And the Galatians were falling victim. They're capitulating to the plus of some Torah observance. And a lot of 21st century evangelicals think that to be living as a Christian and to be relating with Jesus, I have to rest in Jesus' grace of relating to me and meeting me where I'm at, plus something or some things. And Paul would say, no, that's another version of the agitator coming in and threatening to undo the Christian life and maybe even retroactively threaten the salvation that came before the Christian life.
Right. And I think especially from my background, that last aspect is the most important, because even though it's unspoken, and I think grace alone is something that would be taught or said, there is this kind of understanding in a way that is at least maybe not taught, but fostered, that if you trust in Jesus, you still need to have a certain understanding of certain doctrines in order to be really a Christian. I think you get into some of those conversations with especially a lot of the more academically disposed branches of Christianity. And those who've listened to the podcast know I came out of a more Calvinistic background early on. And so you see a lot of that, where you have to understand certain versions of certain doctrines in order to be really considered a full Christian in some circles, depending on who you're talking to, even though they wouldn't really affirm that. And I think this is going to apply to everywhere, from those who are very heavy on certain practices and sacraments, understanding that these are vehicles for reminding us of truth, not things that are adding to our salvation. On the other hand, you have the free grace movement, where it is completely just me resting in Jesus. I don't have to do anything to express my loyalty, to actually show that is something that I actually hold. That I actually love and trust Jesus. And so I think this is really going to speak to all sides of the aisle here.
Yeah, I think you're right. It speaks to all sides of the aisle. That's a more gracious way of putting it. I was going to say we can hit everybody where they live. I have
perfect Bible thumping tool, Galatians.
In the sort of the write-up that I did for myself that I shared with you towards the end, I give lots of different pluses from all over the spectrum. My relationship with Jesus, my living as a Christian, is based on grace plus striving to be found acceptable to God, or plus attaining a given standard of moral behavior, or plus of devoting a certain amount of my time or money to certain ministries, or plus having a certain lifestyle fitting into the Christian culture in my area, or plus the one you said, having a certain correct interpretation of a certain doctrine, or plus a certain political leaning, or plus getting baptized, or plus being a zealous enough evangelist. Like every different Christian subculture out there will add one or more pluses. If they're not, it's human nature to add pluses. That's what Paul's recognizing.
Right, and all those things are good things. Well, most of them are good things, but we have the tendency to say, this is the thing that you really need to pay attention to pretty much as the gospel. And that is exactly what this letter is telling us that is misguided. And I'm hoping that it will add the nuance to our understanding to really identify those things that we are holding close to the gospel and moving them away, so we have a proper understanding of who's in and who's out, and it's not related to things that are secondary and tertiary to the gospel by any means.
The way that you just positively stated it is really important, and the way that Paul negatively states it is also very crucial, because the impulse for somebody who isn't thinking consciously about this might say, well, my particular context is I have to have grace plus being zealous about evangelizing. And I have grace, but I don't have zeal about evangelizing, so I must not really be a Christian, or I must be falling backwards in my faith, or I must be falling away from God. And Paul would say, hang on. Right. If you've got the grace, you've still got the intimacy with God. Don't impose upon yourself that other thing that will make you feel like you're falling away from God. That's something doable.
No, that's really good. I think this is going to apply to a lot of people, because I think everyone who comes to Christ, especially in, I guess, at least in American context, for what I can speak for, and just the presuppositions that we have either wrestle with these things or know plenty of people who do if we are plugging into our Christian communities, which we should be. So I think this is going to be very helpful. Yeah, and so that's why I appreciate you coming back on and giving us just an understanding of this important book. So next time we will jump into Galatians 1 and just start tracking through Paul's argumentation and, again, get a better understanding of the nuances that are going to lead us to all of these proper understandings of grace and our relationship to Christ.